It wasn't weakness that destroyed them, it was their hidden strength. Jung saw it again and again in his patients. The kindest, most empathic souls, those who absorbed every wound, soothed every silence, carried every secret, were not crushed because they were fragile. They were crushed because their sensitivity was a form of power so volatile, so ungoverned, that it consumed them from within. Here lies the paradox. What you think will protect you, compassion, adaptability, resilience, may be the very qualities that lure predators, parasites, and manipulators to your door. You were not broken because you felt too much. You were broken because you never learned how to carry what you felt. Carl Jung wrote that, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." What he meant is terrifying in its simplicity. Your gifts, left unexamined, become your shackles. The empath's generosity becomes a feeding ground for narcissists. The seeker's awakening becomes a desert of lost motivation. The rare personality's brilliance becomes the cage of alienation. You see, society praises light, but Jung knew that unintegrated light is just as dangerous as shadow. He warned that the empath's radiant openness could mutate into exhaustion, that the awakened individual could collapse into nihilism, and that the rare soul could drown in their own difference, not because they were weak, but because they carried a frequency the collective could not hold. And yet, this is where the promise lies, because what destroys you when unconscious transforms you when integrated. Jung called this the transcendent function, the moment when opposites, strength and weakness, shadow and light, despair and clarity, merge into a higher state of being. So let me be clear. You are not here because you are too fragile for this world. You are here because this world is too fragile for the truth you carry. They see your compassion and mistake it for naivety. They sense your intuition and dismiss it as imagination. They feel your depth and call it heaviness. But Jung knew differently. He knew that the very traits that mark you for exploitation are the same ones that, when made conscious, make you unstoppable. That is the paradox, and that is the path we will walk together. Because if you can survive the paradox without collapsing into despair, you will discover what Jung's most terrifying patients and his most transcendent ones eventually found. The gift is the wound, and the wound is the gateway. Jung once treated a man who seemed, by all appearances, perfectly intact. A banker in Zurich, well-dressed, highly regarded, with a family who praised him as stable. Outwardly, he lived what society calls success. Yet Jung noticed something unsettling. When this man spoke of his own life, there was no warmth. His voice carried the cadence of someone narrating a stranger's story. This wasn't depression in the ordinary sense. It was what Jung later termed soul loss. The man had been swallowed not by failure, but by his own mask. He had spent years in what Jung called the performance theater, a space where the persona becomes the entire personality. He laughed at jokes he didn't find funny, agreed with colleagues he secretly despised, and even at home, played the role of devoted husband without ever revealing his private longings. Jung wrote that the greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived lives of the parents, and this patient was living that tragedy in real time. Every instinct, every authentic desire had been buried beneath obligation. He hadn't lost touch with his career, he had lost touch with himself. But here is the paradox. He wasn't destroyed because he lacked strength. He was destroyed because his adaptive strength had calcified into self-betrayal. He was too good at suppressing, too efficient at adapting, too skilled at wearing the mask. Society rewarded him for this performance, promotions, praise, prestige, and yet every accolade made him emptier. Jung recognized that his patient had entered one of the 7 dangerous places that corrode the psyche, the silent suffering space. On the surface, harmony. Underneath, starvation. No outbursts, no open wounds, no visible scars, just a slow erosion of aliveness. And when Jung pressed him gently, "What do you want?" the man could not answer, not because he was unwilling, because he no longer knew. This is what made Jung call the case one of the most terrifying he had seen. The patient hadn't been ruined by violence or trauma, but by compliance. He had abandoned himself so thoroughly that even his shadow was silent. Jung understood the danger. A man who forgets himself does not disappear quietly. He becomes vulnerable to possession, by ideology, by collective hysteria, by the projections of others. Because when the inner compass is gone, anything outside can hijack your course. This is why Jung insisted that individuation, the process of becoming whole, is not a luxury for poets or mystics. It is a matter of psychic survival. Without it, you become a hollow shell in which society can plant whatever script it desires. The banker never came to Jung complaining of pain. He came complaining of boredom. But boredom, Jung warned, is not trivial. It is the whisper of the soul, begging to be remembered. And so Jung posed the question that will now turn to you. When the roles are stripped away, who remains? Because this isn't just the banker's story. This is the risk for anyone who forgets that masks are tools, not identities. Before you can choose your mask, before you can diagnose which archetype runs you, you must understand the terrain. Jung called it the shadow, not darkness in the moral sense, but darkness in the astronomical sense, the side of the psyche that simply does not receive light. The shadow contains everything you deny, everything you exile, everything you cannot or will not see in yourself. Sometimes it is rage, sometimes it is envy, but sometimes it is brilliance, courage, erotic vitality. Jung warned us, the shadow is 90% pure gold. What we repress as shameful often contains our richest energies. Think of it this way. Your persona, the mask you present to the world, is designed for acceptance. It smiles, it adapts, it harmonizes. Because society rewards smooth edges, you learn early to sand down the parts of yourself that scare others, or scare you. Because you want love, therefore you banish aggression. Because you want safety, therefore you hide desire. Because you want belonging, therefore you disown independence. But the psyche does not delete, it only stores. Everything you banish goes underground, and the longer it stays there, the more it twists into forms you don't recognize. This is why the empath, praised for endless compassion, eventually erupts with surgical precision at betrayal. This is why the awakened seeker, who thought enlightenment would be bliss, collapses into nihilism when old illusions burn away. This is why the rare personality, gifted with depth, turns bitter when constantly unseen. Jung saw this pattern so often that he called shadow projection the most dangerous mechanism in human relationships. Because what we cannot admit in ourselves, we inevitably accuse in others. The manipulator who swears everyone else is manipulative. The adulterer who obsesses over their partner's loyalty. The tyrant who screams about freedom. Here is the law of the psyche. What you refuse to own, owns you. This is why integration matters. Because if you do not meet your shadow, you will marry it, hire it, or elect it. Jung warned that whole nations could become possessed by disowned archetypes, just as individuals could be swallowed by them. So when I say choose your mask, understand. The choice is not cosmetic, it is diagnostic. The mask you instinctively reach for is a clue to your shadow, the part of you that has been denied the longest, and therefore runs you the strongest. To walk further, you must be willing to ask, what part of me have I most consistently exiled? And what would happen if I invited it back into the light? Because until you face the shadow, the mask is not your servant, it is your master. Now comes the moment of encounter. You have heard the theory, you have seen the banker's hollow mask, you have glimpsed the shadow beneath. But talk is not enough. Jung never believed in psychology as abstraction. He believed in confrontation. So here is your confrontation. 4 masks lie before you, the savior, the judge, the rebel, the caretaker. Do not analyze, do not debate. Simply notice. Which one would you reach for if you had to enter a high-stakes room right now? Which one feels like your armor, your performance, your survival kit? Jung discovered that the unconscious reveals itself not through essays, but through impulses. The first instinct is the truest compass. Because the unconscious does not hesitate, only the ego hesitates. As you choose, hold the questions in silence. What problem does this mask solve for me? What admiration do I hope it secures? What fear does it quiet? If you pick the savior, perhaps you fear uselessness and seek to redeem. If you pick the judge, perhaps you fear chaos and seek to impose order. If you pick the rebel, perhaps you fear suffocation and seek freedom at any cost. If you pick the caretaker, perhaps you fear abandonment and seek belonging through service. But remember, your mask is not the enemy. Your mask is a clue. It points directly to the disowned part of you that keeps demanding a stage. Jung wrote that every persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. It is a compromise, not a crime. Yet compromises left unconscious become prisons. And that is why this choice matters. Because the mask you select in 60 seconds is not random, it is diagnostic. It reveals not just your strategy, but your vulnerability. And this is where we must go next, into the taxonomy of masks themselves, to see how each one grants power, how each one exacts a cost, and how each one, if made conscious, becomes a tool instead of a tyrant. You have chosen your mask. Now understand the family of masks it belongs to. Jung taught that the persona is never arbitrary. It is archetypal. It emerges from the same deep patterns that shaped myth, religion, and collective history. Here are the 4 great masks, 4 strategies of survival, 4 distorted mirrors of the self. Each grants power. Each extracts a price. The savior. This is the mask of redemption. You become the fixer, the rescuer, the one who steps into chaos with the promise of restoration. Its gift is initiative. You act where others freeze. But its shadow is control disguised as care. The savior does not merely help, it secretly demands transformation in return. I healed you, therefore you owe me. Jung saw this pattern so often he warned that unexamined helping becomes disguised domination. The judge. This is the mask of clarity. You see the pattern, the flaw, the truth that others ignore. Its gift is discernment. Without judges, chaos reigns. But its shadow is coldness. The judge values being right above being related. Jung noted that when thinking is overdeveloped, feeling atrophies, one becomes sharp but sterile. This mask forgets that people are not problems to be solved, but mysteries to be held. The rebel. This is the mask of fire. You refuse conformity, you defy the imposed order, you burn the script before anyone else can hand it to you. Its gift is courage. Without rebels, no system evolves, but its shadow is chaos. Jung observed that the drive for freedom can become unconscious compulsion, destroying every container simply to prove aliveness. The rebel risks mistaking destruction for liberation. The caretaker. This is the mask of harmony. You soothe, you mend, you anticipate. Its gift is empathy, the invisible glue of families, communities, even nations. But its shadow is self-erasure. The caretaker confuses love with absorption, becoming the vessel for everyone else's pain until nothing of the self remains. Jung called this participation mystique, the dangerous fusion where the individual dissolves into the needs of the group. Notice something crucial. Each mask begins as medicine. The savior prevents collapse. The judge prevents delusion. The rebel prevents stagnation. The caretaker prevents disconnection. But because they are unconscious, therefore, they always overplay. What begins as medicine becomes poison. Jung warned that every archetype carries both God and demon. When you wear the mask without awareness, you are possessed by the archetype instead of partnered with it. And so, the task is not to destroy the mask. It is to integrate it, to see its gift without surrendering to its tyranny. From here, we must descend deeper. We must study each mask in its full complexity, its origin story, its secret wound, its relational patterns. Only then can you reclaim it as tool instead of master. The first mask is the most seductive, the savior. At first glance, it looks noble. Who wouldn't want to be the rescuer, the healer, the one who arrives with answers when others collapse? Jung noticed this pattern so frequently among his patients that he came to see it as both heroic and catastrophic. The savior is born early. A child watches chaos at home, an alcoholic parent, a fractured marriage, a silent depression in the mother's eyes, and learns quickly, if I fix them, I will be safe. Love becomes conditional, tethered to usefulness. And because survival is stronger than innocence, the child adapts. They become the rescuer. They learn to predict moods, to anticipate crises, to soothe wounds that were never theirs to heal. This is the origin story. Usefulness as identity. The gift is initiative. The savior acts. When others freeze in fear or drown in confusion, the savior knows what to do. Jung admired this as a form of archetypal strength, the healer, the redeemer, the lightbringer. He even compared it to the myth of the wounded healer who finds meaning in tending others because they could not tend themselves. But the shadow is control, because the savior rarely saves without expectation. Deep inside lurks the unspoken contract. I gave you life, therefore you owe me transformation. It is no longer help, it is leverage. And when the other resists, the savior grows resentful. They play the martyr, they burn themselves out, but secretly blame the unhealed for not converting their sacrifice into salvation. Jung saw this dynamic destroy marriages and friendships alike. The savior spouse who endlessly improves their partner until intimacy curdles into resentment. The savior manager who rescues underperforming employees only to feel betrayed when loyalty isn't returned. The savior friend who offers support but quietly tallies debts. And because the savior cannot sit with helplessness, they rob others of growth. Jung warned that interference, even when cloaked as care, can paralyze the soul's natural development. Notice the paradox. The savior begins with love but ends in control. They believe they are fighting chaos, but often they are fighting their own fear of uselessness. So what is the way out? Jung insisted that individuation requires the savior to withdraw their projections. Stop rescuing others as a way of rescuing the abandoned child inside. Name the contract. Say it aloud. I help, but I do not own your change. He advised one patient, a woman who had spent decades saving her husband from his own addictions, to practice what he called scaffolding, not saving. Offer support with boundaries, with expiration dates. Build the structure, then step back. If the other grows, the scaffold served its purpose. If not, the scaffold collapses, and the responsibility is theirs, not yours. To integrate the savior is not to abandon helping. It is to purify it, to move from control to compassion, from leverage to freedom. And remember this law of archetypes. Every overplayed strength becomes its opposite. The overextended savior becomes the destroyer. But the integrated savior becomes the guide, present, empowering, but never possessed by the need to control outcomes. And so we close the first mask, the rescuer, the redeemer, the one who saves at the cost of their own soul. In Jung's words, no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The savior must descend into the roots of their own helplessness, or else they will spend their life addicted to the helplessness of others. The second mask is colder, sharper, the judge. Unlike the savior, who hides fear beneath generosity, the judge hides fear beneath certainty. Jung described this type as ruled by an overdeveloped thinking function, razor-sharp but often estranged from the heart. The judge is usually born in a childhood where unpredictability reigned. A parent's mood shifted like storms, or rules seemed arbitrary and unjust. The child learned, If I can analyze, if I can categorize, I will be safe. Order became their fortress. Ambiguity became the enemy. And so the judge grows into adulthood, wielding discernment as a weapon. Their gift is clarity. They see flaws others overlook, spot inconsistencies before they metastasize. In organizations, judges are indispensable. They cut through illusions, prevent disasters, establish standards. Jung valued this quality, noting that discernment is the spine of civilization. Without it, chaos devours progress. But here is the paradox. What begins as clarity calcifies into contempt. The judge is prone to believing not just that they see more clearly, but that they alone see correctly. They forget that perception is always filtered through psyche, and so their verdicts harden. Partners become irrational, colleagues incompetent, children ungrateful. The judge ceases to ask, "What can I learn?" and begins to declare, "I already know." Jung warned that thinking, when isolated, grows tyrannical. When the judge disowns feeling, they lose warmth. They become clinically correct, but relationally dead. People leave their presence feeling dissected, not understood. Consider the marriage where one partner constantly evaluates, the dinner is adequate, the career choice foolish, the emotions overblown. What was meant to provide guidance corrodes into domination, or the workplace where a judge leader insists on perfection. Projects stall, creativity shrivels, and subordinates live in quiet terror of disapproval. This isn't wisdom. This is what Jung called inflation. The ego identifies with the archetype of lawgiver, forgetting its own limits. And inflation always ends in collapse, whether through isolation, rebellion of those around them, or the judge's own burnout from carrying the impossible weight of omniscience. So how does the judge integrate? By replacing verdicts with diagnostics. Instead of pronouncing, "You are incompetent," the integrated judge asks, "What function is failing? What support is missing?" Instead of silently withdrawing affection when standards aren't met, they practice what Jung called the feeling function, valuing connection as much as correctness. One of Jung's patients, a lawyer whose marriage was crumbling, finally grasped this when he admitted, "I never once asked my wife how she felt. I only asked if her reasoning made sense." That moment, when analysis bows to empathy, marked the beginning of his individuation. The judge, purified, becomes not the executioner, but the guidepost, a discerning eye without contempt, a clear voice that names reality without crushing the soul beneath it. But until that integration, the judge remains possessed, driven less by truth than by terror of uncertainty. And here is Jung's law. The more rigid the certainty, the deeper the unconscious chaos it conceals. Thus we close the second mask. Sharp, cold, indispensable, but deadly when worshipped. The judge must remember what the ancients taught. Law without love becomes tyranny, and clarity without compassion becomes blindness. Now we turn to fire. The third mask, the rebel. If the savior fears uselessness and the judge fears chaos, the rebel fears suffocation. Their battle cry is simple: "You will not contain me." Jung recognized this archetype in countless patients, those who could not tolerate confinement, whether in families, in careers, or in creeds. The rebel is born in captivity, perhaps a home ruled by rigid dogma, where every question was met with, "Because I said so." Perhaps a culture that demanded conformity, punishing deviation with shame. Or perhaps subtle bonds, expectations of the good daughter, the loyal son, the quiet worker. In such soil, freedom becomes oxygen. To breathe, the child must defy. Thus emerges the gift, courage. The rebel burns away illusions others accept. They challenge what is presented as absolute. They cut new paths through forests of stale tradition. Without them, revolutions never ignite, cultures never evolve, individuals never break their cages. Jung even noted that the psyche itself evolves through rebellion, the eruption of repressed contents against the tyranny of the conscious ego. But as always, the shadow follows. What begins as liberation calcifies into compulsion. The rebel may burn every bridge not because it must fall, but because burning proves aliveness. They may confuse self-sabotage for freedom, quitting jobs impulsively, ending relationships prematurely, destroying containers before they have tested their strength. Jung called this enantiodromia, the law that every extreme turns into its opposite. Freedom without anchor becomes a prison of chaos. The rebel, terrified of bondage, ends up enslaved to their own defiance. Consider the artist who refuses every commission as selling out, only to starve in obscurity, or the partner who abandons intimacy the moment it deepens, fearing love as a trap, or the visionary who launches new projects but never sustains them, each act of rebellion collapsing into ashes before anything can bear fruit. The tragedy is this: the rebel does not realize that their truest freedom is not in burning structures, but in choosing which structures to build. As Jung observed, individuation is not endless revolt but conscious form, the ability to create an inner law rather than remain bound by outer laws. Integration comes when the rebel learns constructive defiance. They break what must be broken, but protect what must endure. They channel fire into forge rather than wildfire. They stop mistaking destruction for destiny and begin asking, "What am I building through my refusal?" One of Jung's patients, a man who abandoned career after career, finally confronted his pattern when Jung asked him, "Are you rebelling against chains or against your own potential?" That question cracked him open. For the first time, he saw that freedom meant more than escape. It meant responsibility. The integrated rebel becomes the pioneer, not a runaway but a pathmaker. They still defy, but their defiance serves life rather than scorches it. They hold the paradox: freedom with fidelity, defiance with discipline. But until then, the rebel remains possessed by fire, mistaking every flame for liberation while secretly becoming its slave. Thus we close the third mask: brilliant, courageous, but self-destructive when unconscious. The rebel must learn what Jung insisted of every archetype. True power is never in opposition alone. It is in integration, when the force that once burned bridges begins building worlds. And now we arrive at the softest mask, and perhaps the most quietly dangerous: the caretaker. If the savior rescues, the judge analyzes, and the rebel burns, the caretaker soothes. Their fear is not chaos or suffocation, but abandonment. Their survival code whispers, "If I am indispensable, I will not be left behind." The caretaker is often born in households where peace was fragile: a father's rage, a mother's depression, siblings constantly at war. The child learns early that the only way to keep the family intact is to regulate everyone else's emotions. They fetch, they appease, they anticipate. And when it works, when the room calms, when the parent smiles, the child feels, if only for a moment, safe. Here lies their gift: empathy. The caretaker can read the unsaid. They sense tension before a word is spoken, detect grief in the way a hand trembles, soothe wounds that others don't even notice. Jung saw this as part of what he called participation mystique, the ability of certain souls to merge with the emotional field of others. Without such people, families fracture, teams dissolve, societies collapse. But here, too, is the shadow. Because when the caretaker fuses too deeply, they lose themselves. They confuse love with absorption. They become a vessel for everyone else's unprocessed shadow: parents' rage, partners' insecurity, friends' despair. Slowly, they evaporate. Jung noted that such individuals don't present in therapy with their own problems. They present carrying the problems of an entire family system. The tragedy is that the caretaker is loved for the very thing that kills them. They are praised as selfless, admired as always there, canonized as the glue of the family. But selflessness is not sainthood, it is erasure. The caretaker smiles while silently vanishing. Consider the mother who lives entirely through her children's needs, only to discover decades later that no one truly knows her. Or the employee who absorbs every crisis at work, protecting the company while their own dreams rot in silence. Or the friend who listens endlessly but cannot remember the last time anyone asked, "And how are you?" Jung warned that the unlived life is the greatest tragedy, and the caretaker risks exactly this, to live only for others, never for the self. So how does the caretaker integrate? By practicing what I call frictional love. Instead of soothing every discomfort, they learn to allow tension. They discover that saying no is sometimes the highest form of care. They refuse to absorb what isn't theirs, not out of coldness, but out of clarity. One of Jung's patients, a nurse who had collapsed from exhaustion, wept when he told her, "You are not loving when you erase yourself. You are only teaching others that you do not exist." That sentence freed her. For the first time, she began to care with edges, holding compassion without surrendering her own center. The integrated caretaker becomes not a sponge, but a vessel. Still empathetic, but strategically so. Still nurturing, but with boundaries. Still present, but no longer possessed. But until that transformation, the caretaker remains trapped in their paradox, keeping everyone else alive while slowly dying inside. Thus we close the fourth mask, gentle, indispensable, yet devastating when unconscious. The caretaker must remember what Jung wrote. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. For them, this means daring to care not only for others, but for the self they have so long abandoned. You have now seen the four masks in isolation, but in reality, few people wear only one. Jung warned that the psyche is not a single note, but a chord, multiple archetypal patterns sounding at once. The masks cross-wire, creating hybrid identities that are even harder to untangle. Consider the savior caretaker. This is the person who rescues and nurtures simultaneously, giving endlessly until collapse. They become the indispensable axis of every system, family, workplace, friendship circle. Their secret wound is that they do not know who they are apart from usefulness. They fear that without constant service, they will vanish. The solution? Rotation. Consciously alternate between roles, allowing space where they are neither rescuer nor caretaker, but simply self. Then the judge-savior. Here discernment and control fuse. They rescue, but only according to their standard. Partners and children feel the weight of conditional acceptance. I will help you, but only if you improve according to my blueprint. This hybrid often breeds silent rebellion in those around them. Jung would say their work is to define good enough thresholds, because perfection is not salvation, it is tyranny disguised as virtue. The rebel judge is a paradox in motion. They defy every structure, yet construct rules of their own with iron severity. They rail against authority while demanding loyalty to their personal code. Their danger is hypocrisy, destroying external tyrannies while building internal ones. Their work? To write a charter of values they can be held accountable to, transforming rebellion into sustainable reform. And the caretaker rebel, sweet until they explode. For months they absorb everyone's needs, never saying no, never setting edges. But then one day, the dam bursts. They torch relationships, quit jobs, sever ties in acts of sudden violence. This is the cycle of absorption and eruption. The way through is daily micro-boundaries, small refusals, small assertions, preventing the final volcanic collapse. Jung stressed that integration is not about eliminating contradictions, but learning to hold them. The psyche is not a machine with interchangeable parts. It is a living tension between opposites. The goal is not harmony without friction, but a conscious balance where friction generates energy rather than destruction. Because composites, left unconscious, create blind spots. The savior-caretaker cannot see how their love imprisons. The judge-savior cannot see how their standards humiliate. The rebel judge cannot see how their freedom becomes another cage. and the caretaker rebel cannot see how their patience breeds explosions. The task is simple, but not easy. Identify your chord. Which masks are you playing at once? Where do they harmonize and where do they strangle? Only then can you begin to compose a life that is not noise, but music. And this brings us to the deeper risk. For when masks fuse and operate unconsciously, they do not just create complexity, they create danger. Jung warned that misuse of the persona leads to psychic inflation, collapse, and even collective possession. Which is why our next step must be clear, to study the 3 specific dangers of mask misuse. You have seen the masks, and you have seen their hybrids. But now we must confront the darker reality. Masks are not neutral. Jung warned that the persona, when unconsciously worshipped, becomes demonic. It does not protect the psyche, it devours it. There are 3 dangers. Danger 1, identity fusion. This is when the mask becomes the self. The savior no longer says, "I help." They say, "I am help." The judge no longer says, "I think." They say, "I am truth." The caretaker no longer says, "I soothe." They say, "I am love itself." And the rebel no longer says, "I defy." They say, "I am freedom incarnate." The peril here is obvious. Once identity fuses with persona, individuation halts. The person cannot imagine existence beyond the mask. Jung warned that this is the death of the soul, the point where the human being becomes a role, a function, a costume without essence. Danger 2, moral laundering. This is when the mask is used to justify harm. The savior wounds others in the name of helping. The judge humiliates in the name of truth. The rebel destroys in the name of authenticity. The caretaker smothers in the name of love. Jung saw this repeatedly in patients who believed they were virtuous because their intention was noble. But intention does not erase impact. Laundered cruelty is still cruelty. In fact, it is more dangerous because it hides beneath the aura of righteousness. Danger 3, shadow inflation. This is when the unintegrated mask projects its opposite outward. The judge, disowning their own chaos, condemns everyone else as disorderly. The rebel, denying their own dependency, mocks others for being compliant. The caretaker, suppressing their own anger, labels others as selfish. The savior, blind to their own neediness, accuses others of ingratitude. Jung named this projection the most insidious danger of all, because it convinces the individual that their enemy is always outside, never inside. Do you see the chain? Fusion, laundering, inflation. Because the mask fuses with the self, therefore, every act is laundered as moral, therefore every flaw is inflated onto others. The person becomes untouchable in their own eyes. They no longer reflect, they only accuse. Jung warned that this spiral does not merely ruin individuals, it destabilizes entire families, institutions, even nations. Collective possession begins with masks worn too long. An ideology masquerades as savior or judge or rebel or caretaker, and millions suffer beneath its shadow. This is why individuation matters, not because self-knowledge is a luxury, but because unexamined masks corrode both personal lives and collective systems. And so the question becomes urgent. How do we move from unconscious possession to conscious partnership with the mask? Jung's answer was process, a disciplined method of detection, differentiation, and deployment, a path by which the mask becomes tool, not tyrant. This path is what we turn to now. We have seen the masks. We have traced their dangers. Now comes the work of transformation. Jung insisted that the mask itself is not the enemy. It becomes destructive only when unconscious. The task is not to discard it, but to integrate it, what he called bringing the unconscious into relationship with the ego. This happens in 3 phases. Phase 1, detection. The first act of power is awareness. You must notice when the mask slides into place. Jung taught that consciousness is strengthened by ritual, so create what he called daily audits. After a conversation, pause for 2 minutes. Ask, Which mask was I wearing? What did it protect me from? What did it cost me? If you recognize the Savior, perhaps you were rescuing to avoid your own helplessness. If the judge, perhaps you dismissed someone to shield against your fear of being wrong. If the rebel, perhaps you defied to avoid vulnerability. If the caretaker, perhaps you soothed to silence your own loneliness. This naming act is critical. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." To detect the mask is already to weaken its possession. Phase 2, differentiation. Once you can see the mask, you must separate it from the self. This means writing what Jung called the job description of the mask, what it may do and what it may not do. For example, the Savior may offer support, but may not demand transformation in return. The judge may clarify patterns, but may not weaponize truth against intimacy. The rebel may defy what is dead, but may not burn what still has life. The caretaker may soothe, but may not erase their own existence. Why write this? Because adrenaline narrows choice. In the heat of the moment, you cannot negotiate with the mask. Therefore, you must pre-commit in calmness. Differentiation creates boundaries not only with others, but with yourself. Phase 3, deployment. Once detection and differentiation are practiced, the mask can be worn consciously. You no longer identify with it. You choose it, like armor taken off the wall for a specific battle. The Savior can scaffold rather than rescue. The judge can diagnose rather than condemn. The rebel can reform rather than destroy. The caretaker can nurture without dissolving. Here Jung introduced the idea of auxiliary functions, pairing the dominant mask with its neglected opposite. The Savior must pair with detachment, the judge with warmth, the rebel with stewardship, the caretaker with directness. This pairing balances the archetype, preventing possession. And so the chain is reversed. Because you detect, therefore you can differentiate. Because you differentiate, therefore you can deploy. Because you deploy, therefore you are free. But Jung warned, a method without practice is self-deception. The masks are ancient archetypal forces. They do not yield to theory. They yield only to repeated discipline. Which is why the next step is crucial, maintenance practices that keep the integration alive. Integration is not a single act. It is a rhythm. Jung warned that without repetition, the unconscious reclaims its throne. Therefore, maintenance is not optional. It is the daily hygiene of the psyche. Here are 5 practices to sustain your relationship with the masks. 1. Weekly mask rotation. Choose one conversation or one meeting each week to lead from a mask you rarely wear. If you are always the caretaker, practice the judge. Speak one truth without softening. If you are always the rebel, practice the caretaker. Attune rather than defy. This rotation keeps the psyche flexible, preventing fixation. 2. Friction reps. Every day practice one small boundary, a no to a request, a pause before agreeing, a refusal to over-explain. These micro-reps inoculate against collapse. Jung taught that shadow integration begins in small acts of courage. Daily frictions strengthen the muscle of individuation. 3. Repair ritual. When you overplay a mask, and you will, repair consciously, name it. Apologize not for intention, but for impact. Example: I realize I slipped into judge mode and made you feel small. That was not fair. Repair collapses inflation and restores humility. 4. Witness circle. Select one trusted person who can name your mask aloud when you are blind to it. Jung called this objective feedback, an external mirror to balance inner blindness. The condition is simple. When they say it, you listen. No defense, no rebuttal. 5. Energy ledger. Track which roles charge you and which deplete you. At the end of the week, write, which mask left me alive, which left me drained. Jung understood psychic energy as finite. Without management, the masks cannibalize it. With awareness, you begin to invest it wisely. These practices are not dramatic. They are small, but small acts, repeated, rewire the relationship between ego and archetype. Jung compared individuation to alchemy, not a single transformation, but a long heating, cooling, dissolving, and recombining until something incorruptible emerges. And so, these habits are your fire, your crucible. They keep the work alive long after inspiration fades. From here, we turn to living demonstrations, because practices are powerful, but scenes make them unforgettable. Jung himself relied on case studies not only to illustrate principles, but to expose their urgency. And so we will now descend into the theater of conflict and watch the masks in motion. Abstractions alone cannot wound you into change. Jung knew this. That is why he filled his seminars with case material, real lives where archetypes were not theory, but blood. Let us walk through 3 scenes where masks clashed, then recalibrated. Scene 1. The couple's fight. Anna and Mark came to Jung with a marriage fraying at the seams. Anna wore the caretaker's mask. She apologized before Mark even spoke, smoothed over his irritation, made herself the buffer. Mark, by contrast, wore the rebel. He stormed out of arguments, rejecting every attempt at harmony as control. For years, their dynamic spun in circles. Anna appeased, Mark erupted. But when Jung exposed the pattern, something shifted. Anna began practicing frictional love, saying, "I care for you, but I will not erase myself." Mark, confronted with his compulsive exits, agreed to a 24-hour cool-off clause. Walk away, but return with words. Slowly, their masks loosened. Anna's empathy gained edges. Mark's fire gained discipline. The marriage did not dissolve. It transformed. Scene 2, the team stand-up. In a Zurich office, a manager ruled with the judge's mask. Every meeting ended with colleagues diminished. "This report is sloppy. Your analysis is naive. We need higher standards." The staff shrank in silence. Productivity fell. Yet the judge-manager called it truth-telling. Jung intervened with diagnostic reframing. Instead of declaring incompetence, he asked, "What function is failing here?" The judge shifted from condemning people to diagnosing processes. Meanwhile, a savior colleague, once addicted to fixing everyone's mistakes, learned to scaffold instead of rescue. Together they created clarity without humiliation, support without smothering. The office began to breathe again. Scene 3. The family boundary. Elena, the eldest daughter, lived as the savior. For decades she rescued her father from his drinking binges, paying his debts, covering his absences, soothing his rage. Her younger brother, the caretaker, absorbed the family's despair in silence. Both believed their survival depended on carrying him. Jung confronted Elena. "Every time you rescue, you prevent his confrontation with himself." It cut deep. She withdrew financial bailouts and stated limits with timelines. "I will help if you seek treatment. If not, this support ends." Her brother practiced daily micro-boundaries, no longer absorbing his father's rage, simply leaving the room. Without their unconscious participation, the father collapsed into his own consequences. For the first time, he faced the choice to change. The siblings discovered that by releasing the mask, they reclaimed their lives. These scenes reveal a single law. When the mask is unconscious, relationships collapse into archetypal theater. But when the mask is named, bounded, and redeployed, relationships recalibrate. Because the masks are not cages, they are costumes. Costumes that can be worn, altered, even set aside. The danger is forgetting they are costumes at all. And this leads us directly into the pitfalls, the common derailers that even the awakened stumble into when practicing integration. Even after the masks are named, the dangers understood, and the practices begun, Jung warned. The unconscious does not surrender easily. It waits for openings. It hunts for fatigue. And so every seeker of individuation must expect ambushes, pitfalls, along the path. Pitfall 1. Over-identification. The first temptation is to mistake awareness for essence. Someone says, "I am the savior. That is simply who I am." But Jung would reply, "No, that is who you became to survive." To confuse the mask for the self is to halt individuation. The correction is simple yet fierce. Change the language. Say not, "I am the savior." Say, "Part of me wears the savior's mask." This small shift creates distance. Language becomes the wedge that pries ego away from possession. Pitfall 2. All or nothing detox. Another error is to try tearing the mask off in one violent gesture. The rebel declares, "I will never conform again." The caretaker says, "From now on, I refuse to help anyone." But Jung cautioned, what you repress returns in distorted form. To amputate the mask is to invite relapse. The solution is dosage, not denial. Reduce, adjust, refine, do not annihilate. Integration means partnership, not war. Pitfall 3. The virtue trap. Here the mask disguises itself as sainthood. The savior calls their control love. The judge calls their contempt truth. The caretaker calls their erasure selflessness. The rebel calls their chaos authenticity. Jung warned that archetypes often hide in moral language. That is why they are so dangerous. The cure is to measure by fruit, not intention. Ask, did my action generate life or did it diminish it? Intentions flatter, outcomes reveal. Pitfall 4. Secret performance, perhaps the most insidious. You integrate in public, you speak wisely, you set boundaries, you confess the mask. But in private, when no one is watching, you regress. The savior still manipulates, the judge still condemns, the rebel still self-sabotages, the caretaker still erases. Jung called this split a failure of shadow work, the refusal to bring the darkness all the way into the light. The remedy is solitude. Audit yourself in the moments unseen. Because individuation is not a performance, it is a covenant with the self. Do you see the pattern? Each pitfall is not an enemy from outside. It is the mask's last defense. Because you have named it, it tries to survive in subtler forms: identity, extremity, morality, performance. But if you can recognize these snares, you disarm them. And then the path remains open. From here, we must turn to history, to the cautionary figures who were swallowed by their masks, and the exemplary ones who mastered them. Because Jung knew, archetypes do not only shape private lives, they sculpt entire destinies. Jung often reminded his students that archetypes are not confined to consulting rooms. They stride across history, wearing crowns and chains, shaping destinies of nations as well as individuals. To see their reach, we must hold two figures side by side, the cautionary and the exemplary. The cautionary. Consider the reformer who began as a savior. His vision was noble. He sought to redeem his society from corruption. Yet the mask fused with identity. I am salvation, he thought. What began as healing became coercion. Dissenters were not merely opponents, they were heretics. Jung would have said he fell into inflation, possessed by the archetype of the Redeemer. History records the ruins, burned bridges, betrayed allies, and a revolution that devoured its children. The savior overplayed becomes the destroyer. The exemplary. Now consider the dissident who began as a rebel. He defied tyranny, refused to bow, endured exile. But unlike the compulsive rebel who burns without aim, he matured. He bound his fire to stewardship. Instead of chaos, he forged new laws. Instead of endless defiance, he built enduring structures of justice. Jung might have called this individuation through enantiodromia, the turning of opposites into a higher synthesis. His rebellion was not an escape, but a foundation, and history remembers him not as an arsonist, but as a pathmaker. Do you see the contrast? Both men began with masks. One was possessed, the other integrated. One mistook the mask for the self, the other wore it as tool. The difference was not fate, it was consciousness. Jung taught that what destroys the unconscious man becomes power in the conscious one. The same archetype, Unexamined is ruin. Examined, it is destiny. And this is why your work matters, because your mask is not only personal, it is cultural. It ripples into families, workplaces, even nations, which is why we must now zoom out, beyond biography, beyond case studies, to the collective stakes. Jung warned that the psyche of the individual and the psyche of the culture are bound by a single thread. What festers in one festers in the other. And what you have seen in the masks, fusion, laundering, inflation, is not merely personal pathology, it is collective crisis. Look at our moment. Algorithms reward the most exaggerated personas. The savior mask blooms in endless online coaches who rescue for profit. The judge hardens into armies of critics issuing verdicts in comment sections, condemning without intimacy. The rebel surges in performative outrage, burning systems without building alternatives. The caretaker dissolves into codependency, entire communities exhausting themselves to regulate the emotions of others. Jung would not be surprised. He wrote that modern man is in danger of losing himself, not because of lack of progress, but because of too much mask. Persona inflation, living for appearances, likes, and projections, creates a society where the self is starved. And what is the result? Collective possession. Families locked in cycles of blame. Nations polarized into warring archetypes. A culture unable to tell the difference between identity and performance. Jung once said, "The world hangs on a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man." Today, that thread trembles. But here lies the hope. Because every individual who integrates their masks weakens the collective possession. Every person who refuses to be only savior, only judge, only rebel, only caretaker, who instead claims the full self, becomes what Jung called a living symbol, a reminder to others that wholeness is possible. Your individuation is not private therapy. It is cultural medicine. Your integration is resistance to a system that feeds on unconscious masks. And this brings us full circle. Back to the paradox with which we began. What destroys you when unconscious transforms you when conscious. The mask is not your enemy. Forgetting it is a mask. That is the true danger. And so, in our final step, we return to the beginning, to the paradox, to the invitation to live it consciously. We began with a paradox. You are not destroyed because you are weak. You are destroyed because your strength, left unconscious, devours you. Now you can see it clearly. The savior who rescues until they collapse. The judge who discerns until they freeze intimacy. The rebel who defies until they burn their own future. The caretaker who nurtures until they vanish from their own life. Each mask begins as medicine and ends as poison, not because it is false, but because it is worshipped. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." The mask is the shoe. It protects you on rough terrain, but wear it forever, and it cripples you. So let this be your consolidation. The mask is a tool. You are the wielder. Your first instinct in the 60-second test was revealing. It showed the archetype most eager to rule you. But now you know the truth. You can wear it, you can set it down, you can even trade it for another, when the moment requires. The paradox is not a curse. It is the gate. What once enslaved you can, when made conscious, become your instrument. The savior can guide without control. The judge can clarify without contempt. The rebel can ignite without destruction. The caretaker can love without erasure. The danger was never that you carried a mask. The danger was forgetting it was a mask. And so, as Jung insisted, individuation is not about discarding roles, but about remembering the self who chooses them. That self, the one beneath all masks, is your only true authority. From here, we move into the closing, your commission, your call to act, and your invitation to step into the work consciously. The danger isn't that you wear masks. Everyone wears them. The danger is that you forget they are masks at all. Now you have seen them, savior, judge, rebel, caretaker. You have traced their origins, their shadows, their dangers. You have practiced detection, differentiation, deployment. You have glimpsed how integration turns poison into medicine. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That is your task now, not to discard your masks, but to wield them consciously, to stop living as a prisoner of archetypes and start living as their steward. So identify your type, speak it aloud, share it in the circle of others who walk this path. Say, "I know my mask, but I am more than it." This confession loosens its hold. And then take the next step. Comment your mask and the boundary you will practice this week. Begin the 7-day integration challenge, rotating masks, setting micro-boundaries, practicing repair. Invite someone you trust to be your mirror, naming your mask when you cannot see it. Because this is not theory, it is transformation. Not just for you, but for the culture that trembles on the thread of the human psyche. The danger isn't that you see too much, feel too much, or defy too much. The danger is failing to build a conscious relationship with that ability. So use it as cultural medicine, as constructive leverage, as the seed of what comes next. Your mask is not your prison, it is your instrument, and the music of yourself is waiting to be played.